Дорогие коллеги, начинаем. Слово имеет Анн Робинс, Национальная галерея Лондона. Лондон в борьбе за новую живопись. Ранние собиратели, дилеры и критики импрессионизма в Британии. Anne Robbins, National Gallery, London, early collectors, dealers and critics of Impressionism in Britain, championing the new painting.
Good afternoon. How does it work? Is it just like this, back and forth? Sorry. Okay, forward and back. Great, thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ilya, for this very kind invitation. I am both thrilled and honored to be here this afternoon and to be able to take part in this conference. So after having heard from Sylvie and Eric about remarkable examples of collectors and collecting of the avant-garde in Paris, I would like you to invite you to point the map cursor on Britain, to look at how the earliest of the late 19th century French avant-garde, Impressionism, gradually imposed itself there. So in Britain, Impressionism was actively marketed by energetic art dealers such as Paul Durand-Ruel, whom Mary brilliantly introduced, embraced by collectors and enthusiastically promoted by critics, resulting in the formation of first-rate Impressionist collections, as well as prompting debates which contributed to the elaboration of a rich critical discourse on this art movement. So in the next half hour, I will try and look at the specificity of this story, that of the reception of Impressionism in Britain. So what happened there? So like on the continent, it developed in stages. Impressionism gained prominence and appreciation thanks to the efforts of forward-thinking dealers and adventurous collectors. However, in Great Britain, it followed a completely different time frame, starting significantly earlier in the early 1870s when the young artists were only starting to emerge as a group, even before the term Impressionism was forged. It is in Britain that Impressionist paintings avant la lettre, or juste après la lettre, were most readily accessible, exhibited, and available for purchase. Yet the paradox is that it is also in Britain that it took longest than anywhere else for this art movement to achieve official recognition. And that would only happen, Impressionism would only come to be validated and actively collected by museums in the early 1920s for reasons we'll explain. So it's very much a story which unfolded in Britain at its own pace, boosted by the exceptional presence and the visibility of these works, and I insist that major paintings were available in London on the art market before anywhere else outside of France. Yet it was slowed down due to the very ambivalent perceptions of these artists and their works in Britain, where they were regarded as stimulating and threatening at the same time. And in fact, almost 50 years elapsed between the moment when a proto-Impressionist painting was put on display in London in the autumn of 1870 and the endorsement of Impressionism by museum officials in the 1920s. So how did this happen? Why did it unroll in that way? This is what this paper will set out to explain and elucidate. So one of the reasons for the early connection of Britain, here namely London, and the soon-to-be-called Impressionists, owes largely to historical accident with the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Monet and Pissarro, and the story is very well known, escaped the Franco-Prussian War. In July 1870, France had declared war to Prussia, and both Monet and Pissarro and a number of other artists escaped the danger of the approaching Prussian army by taking refuge in London that autumn. And there, they started to paint their immediate surroundings. So this is the type of pictures that both of them produced. Monet very much focusing on central London, where he had established himself, and Pissarro painting the suburbs where he was living with his family. So London, obviously, at the time was a vibrant city. It still is. It was a mighty seat of the empire, and lying at European crossroads, it had a particularly lively artistic scene with a well-established network of galleries. So it's not entirely surprising that a young and enterprising art dealer like Durand-Ruel settled there too, escaping France for exactly the same reasons. He was drawn by the opportunities offered by London, of which he already had a very good grasp. So this all started with a physical encounter. Durand-Ruel meets these young artists, exhibits their work straight away in mixed exhibitions he organized in London. So this shows Durand-Ruel still young in his portrait by Hugues Merle of 1866, and this is a modern photograph of New Bond Street, where Paul Durand-Ruel first established his gallery in London during the Franco-Prussian War. So Durand-Ruel met with these young artists, exhibits their work straight away in mixed shows he will start organizing in London. They were exhibition of early and mid-19th century French art, 12 shows in 6 years. And in these mixed shows, he included Barbizon works, so together with the works of Delacroix and more conventional artists. But that gave him an opportunity to show also a number of major works by Manet and by the soon-to-be-called Impressionists. So what exactly was on display in Durand-Ruel's London shows? So there were small landscapes, more views of London by Monet and Pissarro. Still, as you can see, very much in the Barbizon vein, and these kind of pictures did not present any particular challenge to English audiences. Also, images of industrial modernity, which would have appealed to Brits, to British the British entrepreneurial class, such as this Monet Robec stream, but also views of Paris deemed exotic, seen from London, and just glorious early Impressionist works. So even before the opening of the first Impressionist show at Nadar's in Paris in 1874, all of the soon-to-be-called Impressionist artists, at least the bulk of them, Duga, Monet, Pissarro, Renoir, Morisot, and Sisley, had some of the best examples of their work exhibited in London by Durand-Ruel. In shows which in total included about 90 Impressionist or pre-Impressionist works in total. With regard to sales, these were low. All this exhibiting effort resulted in comparatively few sales. But again, we need to remember that all of these sales happened before those made by either Durand-Ruel or any other dealer in any other country than France at the time. So who were these first collectors? So I'll first mention this Louis Hutt, or Hutt, who was a merchant banker of German descent based in London, and this is probably the first Duga and the first Impressionist painting to have entered a British private collection in 1872, both from Durand-Ruel. But there were also among these early collectors and clients foreigners living in London. Sylvie mentioned Jean-Baptiste Faure, the opera singer, who was living in London at the same time as Durand-Ruel. He was performing at the opera in Covent Garden and was actually Paul Durand-Ruel's neighbor in Kensington. There was, so among these foreigners based in London, there was this Jules Bertel, a young French cognac merchant who was established also in Covent Garden, who acquired Pissarro. But there were also Brits born and bred, such as Samuel Barlow, who bought the painting, the Pissarro Rue de Voisin. The road in Upper Norwood was purchased by Bertel. Among the Durand-Well's British buyers was also Henry Hill. So a truly fascinating figure, under-researched, in my opinion. So Henry Hill belonged to that first generation of British English collectors of Impressionism. He was from Brighton. He ran a military tailor business on Old Bond Street. So he was a neighbor of Durand-Well's gallery, which would have facilitated exchanges. And he was also himself a military man. He was a captain in the 1st Sussex Rifles volunteers. Not something you'd guess, judging at the paintings he selected for himself, not wanting to make any kind of silly generalization. So he owned just one Monet, these apple trees in blossom, which he bought from Durand-Ruel, but also a superb Duga. And by 1876, Hill owned no less than 7 Dugas, 6 of which he bought from Durand-Ruel. The class de danse we've already been shown, but also the 2 dancers on a stage from the Courtaulds, the rehearsal from the Met, and also note the inner coherence of this collection. And it was, in Hill's hands, the largest collection of Degas's works in Europe at the time. In fact, his 7th Degas was L'Absinthe, and I'll come back to that later. So what sold in London at the time, in the first half of the 1870s? As you have seen, Degas was probably a favorite. He was best loved from these early collectors. His pictures were the first to find a clientele as well as approval. So why was it so? It's probably because British amateur very much favored figure painting, and that in Victorian England, there was a taste and a demand for this kind of hard-edged narrative scenes, pictures, like ballet scenes and equestrian subjects, sporting subjects by Degas were also very popular. Critics also praised Degas. It was soon noted by critics that Degas had this concern for draftsmanship with form and line. Even though, most, unsurprisingly, most of the critique was negative at the time and antagonistic, very much along the same lines as what you could read in France. It was the Impressionists were criticized for their slapdash and technique and manner. However, as early as 1873, the Times lists Monet, Sisley, and Pissarro in a list of interesting young painters when reviewing an exhibition in 1873. So these early shows may have helped, in fact, with the emergence of the identity of these artists as a group. They actually start to stand out as distinct from the landscape paintings along which they were exhibited at the time in London. So really, in the 1870s, the exceptional presence and exceptional accessibility of Impressionist paintings on British soil was down to the efforts of a single man, Paul Durand-Ruel, who was exhibiting and selling this work. And then this campaign lost momentum as Durand-Ruel was running out of money, but he actually resumed it with renewed vigor in the 1880s. In the early 1880s, when the dealer starts to seek new outlets abroad at a time when the market in France fails to take off. And this second campaign takes the shape of 3 exhibitions the dealer organized in the early 1880s, 82, 83, and 84. And I will focus on the 83 one, extremely significant because it was the first Impressionist show promoting these artists as a group. It was explicitly Impressionist. It had Impressionism in the title, of the show. It was held by Durand-Ruel in a private gallery, which endowed as well on New Bond Street, and it included mostly very recent Impressionist pictures by these two, especially the Monet Road at La Cave it was basically straight off the easel, painted the year before. It drew a great deal of criticism, and here I'm very pleased to this cartoon, which was published in Punch on the 5th of May 1883, recently came to my attention. It's not something that I had become aware of as we were working on the Durand-Ruel exhibition with Sylvie some 5 years ago. But this is a type of criticism here, quite amusing and witty, that this show drew. I won't attempt to translate these very English puns made here, note giving a false impression. But I had fun composing this slide. So all the pictures in the cartoon are in public collections now, but 2. So I'll go clockwise. This is the Duga of the races from the Barbers. Berthe Morisot is in Chicago, and the Duga theater is a pastel in a private collection. Then you will have recognized the Sisley, Ile de la Loge from the New Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, the Woman at the Piano from the Art Institute in Chicago, the Railway from Washington, a astonishing pastel from a private collection which was always dated by Le Moine 1890, so this allows us to precise its date, and a pastel from now in the Musée d'Orsay. So sorry about missing the captions, but I thought that would. It also gives us a wonderful sense of what that exhibition looked like. So it had this very great Impressionist masterpieces, some of the Manet we've just seen, and the Renoir dance at Bougival. This show was also greatly significant because it triggered the first full-length article published on the movement by Frederick Wedmore in the Fortnightly Review, in which he praised the Impressionists for their treatment of everyday life and also praised their directness and their ability to express swift and momentary impressions. So it's an important moment as in as much as it's a first critical response and first analysis of the main principles of Impressionism articulated in English for the first time. So these, yes, as I said, these early shows prompted critics to formulate the principle of the new painting, and as such consolidated its status and favored its further dissemination. And this dissemination happened across a larger network of galleries. So in the late 1880s, see the end of Durand-Ruel's monopoly on that market in Britain. Durand-Ruel is busy elsewhere. He's focusing his attention on America instead in the second part of the 1880s. And a good example of this is that different galleries are taking over. This is images from the Monet one-man show organized in London in April 1889 at the Goupil Gallery. And the Goupil Gallery was the London branch of Bousseau and Valadon in London. So there was this Monet monographic show, which went on for a month. It was the first one-man show of an Impressionist artist held outside of France. It had 20 paintings by Monet, most of them recent, very recent, as you can see. And the story goes that only one sale was made once the show had already closed, and not to just any buyer. But this picture was sold to John Singer Sargent, American by birth. It's just sold after the show, these 5 figures in a landscape, which I've always thought of as a bit of a nod choice. Sargent was an important collector of Impressionist pictures and of Manet, of course. Then this dissemination also happened across several cities, not just Impressionists became visible not just in London anymore, but beyond London. It was on show in Glasgow. In Glasgow, the second city of the empire for trade, and with London, one of the most important economic centers in the world. And it is there that the dealer Alexander Reed, who usually you would probably have expected to see his portrait by Van Gogh here, he had been a friend of roommate of Van Gogh. Reed had returned from Paris and set up his own gallery in Glasgow, La Société des Beaux-Arts, organizing exhibitions both in London and in Glasgow. Among his buyers was the very little-known figure of Sir Edmund Beckett, Lord Grimthorpe, who bought paintings by Monet. Lord Grimthorpe is responsible for the clock tower at Westminster Palace, i.e. Big Ben. Is not the actual architect of Big Ben. He was an horologist, a mechanician, so he actually designed the clock itself. But Reed also developed a whole new Scottish clientele for that kind of painting. So a whole, out of Reed's effort came a whole new generation of entrepreneurial collectors who built a vast collections of French art. So there were industrialists, there were iron and steel merchants and businessmen, and I will only mention a few: Andrew Kirkpatrick, James Duncan of Benmore, Andrew Bain, Duncan McCorkindale, and James Stats Forbes, who was from Aberdeen, Aberdonian railway manager who had been a collector of Barbizon works of the School of The Hague, and bought this Duga and an early Monet. And of course, we should add to the list William Burrell. I haven't added any slide with an example of the great art that Burrell bought, but he assembled a first class, he was a shipbuilder, a Glasgow shipbuilder, and he assembled a first class collection starting in the 1890s. So that moment marks the end of a London-centric market for Impressionist paintings. And in that, it's also in that decade, so the 1890s, that you start to see the beginning of non-commercial shows organized by art societies, i.e. exhibitions of artist associations, which also ensured that the Impressionists get an ever larger audience and is better understood. So this is the New English Arts Club and the International Society of Sculpture Painters and engravers. Yet, some pictures continue to cause a stir. For instance, Degas' L'Absinthe, which Sylvie already showed. Here we need to rewind. I'm going to mention its earlier history, pre-Isaac de Camondo. It was one of the purchases that Henry Hill made in the 1870s. When Henry Hill dies in 1892, the painting is auctioned in London, and it is during the actual auction, it is hissed on the easel, and it's bought, entered the Scottish collection, yet another Scottish collector who lends it to the inaugural exhibition at the Grafton Galleries. And there it is absolutely violently criticized for being, I quote, repulsive. So it is more than just ridiculed. It's really, it becomes the butt of this very, very harsh criticism. Of course, the subject matter invited moral comment, but this particular painting becomes the focus for this increasingly polarized conflict between the so-called new art critics and the more conservative tranche of the critic. It is also at that moment or soon after that the two important texts in English on Impressionism are published after the article by Wedmore I mentioned earlier. There was, of course, a translation of Camille Mauclair, the French Impressionist in 1903, and in 1904, Winford Dewhurst, Impressionist painting, published in 1904, and a book in which, a study in which Dewhurst attempts to diffuse the controversy about Impressionism by positioning it in the continuation of painting tradition. So that's very much his line. He's establishing parallels with the established old masters. So i.e. he's minimizing the novelty of the Impressionists, but insists on its precedence, for the old masters, and also, of course, Constable and Turners, who were particularly revered by the British public. So in this new climate, so the Durand-Ruel, indefatigable as ever, who had assessed the opportunities there, decided to return to London yet again, a final time, to tackle the British market one last time. And as he put it, he wanted to give London its final blow. And this will result in another landmark event in the history of the reception of Impressionism in Britain. It took the shape of a major exhibition organized in London, the largest Impressionist show ever mounted at the Grafton Galleries in 1905. Mary already mentioned it. It was absolutely pivotal, not just for its scale, 315 paintings, pivotal for the caliber of the works exhibited. Here you see one of the Renoir walls. This is the luncheon of the boating party, the slide that Mary showed, and the woman with a cat now in the Clark Institute, so Manet and Cézanne Walls. The show had included 10 paintings by Cézanne, all with the exception of the Vase of Tulips, early Cézanne, which had been bought. All these pictures had been bought from the showcase sale in Paris in 1899. So it was also terribly important for the public response it attracted. No less than 100,000 visitors visited it. But it's also, maybe for our story, the reason why it was so crucial is that it raised for the first time the issue of the acceptability of Impressionism and modern foreign painting in museums. And I will explain why. So at that point, a young art critic for the Sunday Times, who was called Frank Rutter, decided to launch a subscription in his newspaper where he was working for the purchase of an Impressionist work from the Grafton Galleries for the nation. And he managed to raise enough money to purchase a nice Monet Lavacour Under Snow. His reason for launching such a campaign is that he was appalled at the fact that at that point, 1905, there was only one Impressionist work in British public collections, and that was a kind of an oddity. This Duga ballet scene from Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable, which had been bequeathed by Constantine Ione DS, the Anglo-Greek merchant, in 1901. So just one single Impressionist picture in public collections in Britain at the time. So Rutter very much felt that the problem had to be addressed. But the trustees of the National Gallery were thought differently. In fact, that gift was declined officially on the grounds that the National Gallery did not collect paintings by living artists, which was still the case with Monet. With Monet in theory, that rule had been bent so many times that it wasn't worth much. And this is a painting that was purchased instead. So this slightly weak but entirely unobjectionable Buddha. However, the Monet did find a buyer. The Monet Lavacour Under Snow did sell to the Irish dealer and collector, Sir Hugh Lane, well, not yet Sir at that point, Hugh Lane, in 1905. Lane bought it from Durand-Ruel's exhibition. So who was Lane? He was born in Ireland with his aunt, Lady Gregory. He was very much one of the protagonists of the Celtic revival, someone who took up the Irish cause. And as part of this campaign, Lane had formulated plans for a gallery of modern art for the city of Dublin. So Lane went to Paris in 1904, visited galleries and negotiated loans, purchased pictures, but also negotiated loans for an exhibition he organized in Dublin in 1908. So Lane's intention was to organize that show in Dublin to encourage visitors to buy and donate to this soon-to-be created Gallery of Modern Art in Dublin. And so you see the kind of art he was buying, very high quality Impressionist works. And this is, so with Lane, we see for the first time in Britain a collection motivated by public philanthropy, assembled with the idea of giving it for public consumption rather than for his own private enjoyment. So Lane was not the first collector in this field by any means, but he was the first with a public purpose, and he paved the way for a third generation of collectors of Impressionism in Britain, and the most famous of whom is, of course, Samuel Courtauld. But I leave this to Anna for tomorrow. She will deal with Courtauld. So in 1906, so Lane approached the National Gallery in London, wanting to place his pictures on loan at the gallery. And his intention was to seek endorsement in London for pictures that he intended for Dublin. He thought that the validation of museum officials in London would help his cause a great deal. But the loan was turned down by the gallery in keeping with the National Gallery's half-hearted approach, as we put it, to modern art. And then Lane started again in 1913. He went to the then director and offered this time a loan of his whole collection, so 39 pictures. And that caused a stir. One of the most conservative trustees, Lord Ruysdael, described these pictures as production of degraded craze, and compared this the Impressionist paintings in Lane's collection as the productions of pavement artists, so very harsh words. And yet the loan was accepted, but only some of it was put on display. And what happened in the following year is that Lane dies on the Lusitania. Lusitania, coming back from America, is torpedoed. This is the First World War, of course. The Lusitania is torpedoed off the coast of Ireland by German U-boats, and it is found after Lane's death that he had bequeathed his collection to the National Gallery. And this led to one of the longest controversies in the history of the National Gallery, having to do with the question was about the destination of the bequest and whom Lane actually intended the bequest for. And I won't say any more because it takes us too far from the subject. But in effect, with Lane's death and his bequest to the National Collection, from just one painting in public collections in Britain, the nation suddenly finds itself owning a much larger and far more representative group of this artistic movement. So and the painting, including the Lavacour Under Snow, and the umbrellas go on display in 1917, almost half a century after the first Monet was ever shown on the walls of the private gallery in 1870. So Lane is also to be remembered as arguably one of the major collectors of Impressionist art in Britain, yet almost simultaneously From about 1912, other collectors arrive on the map, notably the Davis sisters, who were from Wales. They had inherited a whole fortune from their grandfather, who was the richest man the grandfather, that's right, in Wales, and were very serious collectors. They bought from Paris from 1912, from Durand-Ruel, from Bernheim-Jeune, held exhibitions in Cardiff, and in 1913 offered the Cézanne, the François Zola Dame, this landscape on loan to the National Collection in 1922, a loan which was finally accepted after far more heated debate in the press. So in fact, what had happened is that a few years earlier, in 1918, museum officials had, for the first time in Britain, consciously embarked on acquiring Impressionist and modern French art for the National Collection from the studio and the collection sale of Edgar Degas, who had died a few months earlier, in 1917, in Paris. And a London delegation in 1918, made of Treasury and museum officials. Remember, it's right at the end of the First World War. There's no acquisition budget at all, so a special grant had to be found directly from the Treasury. So all this delegation travels to Paris to purchase pictures. So not so much Impressionist works, but important Delacroix, Ingres, and very great Manets. So this is it's one of the other turning points in that story, because it signals a change of attitude and the National Gallery's active commitment to acquiring Impressionist works, and a commitment which I have to say, which never faltered. So as a conclusion, yes, I thought I'd finish this fragmentary, broad and very partial survey on a timely, if slightly predictable note. What I wanted to stress at a time when fluidity of circulation of people and goods between Britain and the continent might be under threat. I told you it was predictable. That this story of the early reception of Impressionism in Britain is largely a foreign one. It's worth reminding ourselves how much it owes to the ease of exchanges and travel, which allowed for artists, dealers, collectors, and in the first instance, pictures, to cross the channel back and forth, for exhibitions to be organized, leading to the wide dissemination of the best examples of Impressionism in Britain and its enjoyment by an ever wider public. Thank you very much.